So good morning, let's have a look at railway station. I think we've sort of looked at things before, or I've sent a flyer around last year which looked at railway tunnels, but this I'm going to just look at stations from around the county. This one here, this is the Helifield Station, which Leonie's actually just sent me a piece about by email, saying that it's part of a consultation to look at the line that runs off here, actually line to the left, just over this sign here, and that goes to Clitheroe. It's all intact, the line is, but is only used occasionally. It says in the report that it just at the moment, or normally just in the summer months on a Sunday, that link operates between Helifield and Clitheroe, and they're suggesting that it would make a good link to have a regular service on, because obviously here it connects to the Settle-Carlisle line. And there are advantages, I guess, of people getting off the Settle-Carlisle at Helifield and getting on the line to Clitheroe, and it'd be a boon for Clitheroe as well. And it sort of creates a circle, or it closes a loop in a circle of railway lines around sort of the central Pennine area as well. But we'll come back to Helifield a little later on. So just look at the map of railways. It doesn't sort of quite include South Yorkshire on here for some unknown reason, but I've no idea who created the map. The first line that was ever built, if we're looking here, is from Leeds here, that went across to Selby. That opened in 1834. And there's a reason that it went to Selby, because we probably wouldn't understand why it would go there today. But really, it was for the export of coal from Leeds. And it was really the rivalry between these new railways and the existing canals. And it was really about the sort of tithes or tonnages they had to pay for using the air Calder navigation. And of course, the air Calder navigation terminates at Goole, and that was built by the air Calder navigation as well. So they're really sort of getting two bites of a cherry out of that. And so it was really the colliery owners decided that they would avoid the canal system and take the coal straight to Selby, and therefore the railway terminated at the River Ouse, so that they could put it onto their ships and export it around either the river systems or up to the port of Hull, where it could go more nationally. And so that was the reason for it. It also terminated at Selby because I don't think they probably had the money at that time, or perhaps the engineering expertise to cross the bridge, or to bridge the River Ouse there. They did in 1840, when the line was extended out to Hull over here and ended up at the coal dock. So that was really an extension to that. So we see that the Leeds-Selby line here, just looking generally at this map, is that it abutted really two lines. There's one coming from southwards, coming from Derbyshire, that met the line midway as well. And so it really didn't do much more than that until about 1834, 1837 period, because of an economic collapse in Britain at that time. And that really, I guess, gave an opportunity for George Hudson, the railway king of York. He had come into inheritance of about £30,000 in 1827, 1828 or something like that. It was a bit suspect, because I think it came from a far-flung uncle, and he was the only one of the 8 children of the family to actually inherited any of that money. So, but he got hold of that money, and he was going to make a name for himself, and which he did by his largesse in York, really, becoming Lord Mayor 3 times in the 1830s. And one of the things he wanted to do was to centralise the East Coast lines on York. But it would be a big boon for the city. And so the next line that really opened was coming off this Leeds-Selby line again, coming northwards from it to York. So that's really the first railway line he built. And then he built a lot of these lines in red as well, the ones that come across the Wolds, the ones which come southwards as well, and buying up other railway companies. So he really did near enough own all the East Coast main lines. He didn't quite night, get the connectivity just north of London, and had to take a more roundabout route through Cambridge and Peterborough to get there. And but because he was thwarted by other railway companies. And that was a great problem in the 1840s, really, was a rivalry between all these companies. So I said there was a sort of an economic collapse in 1836, 1837, which really stopped a lot of the railways being built. And then they came to be built again 1839, 1840, 1841, when there was another economic collapse. But really gave an opportunity in that period for these railway companies to put acts forward for building even more railway lines. And really, I think it was 1844 that Parliament passed more railway acts than any other year ever since. And really that led to this sort of a great building boom or railway mania, I think they called it, really 1845, 46 and 47. Towards the end of 47, and George Hudson got all the blame for that, led to the economic collapse of the railway industry, largely because he was artificially inflating dividends on shares. He wasn't the only person to that. Nearly almost all other railway companies did it. But I think by pointing at George Hudson, who was quite a figurehead at the time, he was MP for Sunderland, they found a scapegoat in him, and because they sort of got away with it. And so we really don't see a great railway building really after that period. They sort of came a bit piecemeal. They started building really again 1850s, 1854, and we see most of the main lines are being built round about by the mid 1870s. Really, I'd say the last major railway to be built in Yorkshire was the Settle-Carlisle railway that opened in 1876, and since then just little bits have appeared, largely because a lot of people didn't want to get their fingers stung anymore. And even so with the Settle-to-Carlisle railway costing a great deal of money, much more than anticipated. And some of these other schemes that we see, which cross the Wolds, which were built post 1847, were largely reduced in size as well. There were going to be 2-track lines and were just reduced to 1-track lines around there. And so really the confidence never sort of really returned as it was in the mid 1840s. And so we see all these lines had connected through to mainline stations, and they also had a great deal of many minor ones in between. They're not all named even on these ones here, because there were so many of them. We can see here the just main Kiplingcote station there on the extension that went from Market Wheaton to Beverley. We'll be looking at that station because it came redundant as well. And say we see that these other ones extended really out to the seaside to accommodate those summer visitors. That's why we see the lines going out to Withensea here, out to Hornsey, and then the line going to Bridlington, Filey, Scarborough, and then coming off the map up here, running right up the coast, Robin Hood's Bay, up to Redcar as well. And they were all really servicing really those holiday destinations around there. And coming on these railways from York across to Scarborough, it wasn't a fairly easy day trip like it is today, is that these trains would stop at all these minor stations on the route. I think there were 11 along this line. And so what would take probably an hour today was sort of taking over 2 hours in those days. And so it did lead to some rationalisation in those days because people didn't want to spend actually getting, let's say, coming from Leeds and getting to York and then spending an additional 2 hours before they actually got to Scarborough because they ate into their day. And so we see that the started to operate different timetables as well towards the end of the 19th century, so avoiding stopping at many of these smaller stations. And that's why we really got two sort of different train timetables, the local flyer and then the ones that nearly went direct to those destinations. And so these were all basically run by different railway companies because they're all privatised, they built what they wanted, but there were so many of them is that none of them could sort of function economically. And so they sort of really started to amalgamate from the 1850s onwards. And then they were all nationalised in 1947, 1948, and then were privatised again starting in the mid-1990s. And that's where we are at the moment. So let's look at the oldest station, as I mentioned. This is the Selby Station of 1834. I like this quote from a chap called Joseph Morris, who wrote a travel guide, well, a series called Little Guides. This is from 1911. He thought Selby a little town as any in the West Riding. I think we probably never mentioned the Selby Abbey in there, which is one of the oldest and still as a complete abbey today, or William the Conqueror coming up here and his wife giving birth to Henry II. So it does have quite a deal of fame, as well as the railway station in Yorkshire. It's the oldest. It opened in September 1834. This isn't quite the original station. The original station just stands slightly behind here in private land. That's where it terminated at the bank of the Ouse. Like I said, mentioned before, that this line was extended in 1839, 1840 it opened, and that's where we see today's railway station dating from as well. Where did it come from? Well, it didn't come from the actual centre of Leeds. It came from Marsh Lane, which sort of stands in the area where the West Yorkshire Playhouse is today, or I don't know, they might call it the Leeds Playhouse now, which I read a few months ago. And so it really stood by itself, because when the other railway companies came to build lines into Leeds, they centred them on City Square and along Wellington Street, which left really Marsh Lane as an outlier. And really the problem Leeds had with these many lines coming in, if you wanted to go to a different destination, it was likely is that you'd have to get off a train, walk down perhaps Wellington Street to another station's another railway operative station, and get on down there. And to overcome this problem, they built in 1866, they demolished Marsh Lane Station and built the brick viaducts across there using 18 million bricks, sort of culminating in the sort of dark arches which are under Leeds City Station. The reason for the viaduct was that trains could come in from the Selby line on the same level that the city station stands at in City Square today. That was the main reason behind it. And you can say, as the more lines came in, so the dark arches grew underneath that as well. So this was the station here. It was originally built for the Hull and Selby Railway Company. That didn't last particularly long because George Hudson bought it just a few years later, because he wanted to control the railways. He didn't want to have to lease lines from them or pay a percentage to use them. And that was his advantage, is that he didn't want to be stymied in his expansion plans by having another company own it. So he actually bought up the Hull and Selby Railway, and then it became the North Midland Railway, which he fully owned. So we're talking about his empire up in York, and this is where it really all started. That he could say he had the influence and determination to make York the centre of the East Coast railway system. And so being Lord Mayor, he had a lot of power and influence at that time. And so that in the early part of the 19th century, there'd been a great outcry about the city walls that led to the demolition of some of the Barbicans, towers, and the pushing through of new roads into the city. I'd mentioned that before when we looked at the city walls talks in October of last year. But despite this, is that George Hudson had his own way and had the railway push through here in 1839. Not through this archway here, but it's the archway at the other side just down there. This brick-built building dates from about that period as well, and that was a signal box for controlling the trains in and out of the station. It expanded, the station did just further down here, with the building of the second arch. That was built in 1845. And really what we see here was, again, bits of demolition of the wall and the rebuilding of the wall up here. So what we'd lost really were two intermediary towers. These are very small ones that really cut into the just outwards from the wall. So it's a completely flat wall along there now. So really not how it used to look. So the lines came in initially through there and then ran up to, oops. and then ran up to this building. This building is it's now called the Hudson Quarter. George Hudson wasn't sort of particularly liked in York, and George Lehman, his successor running the railway industry here, has got a statue by the wall, but George Hudson hasn't. So I think, I guess I'd call it the Hudson Quarter is a way of putting his name back on the map. This now belongs to York City Council. When they closed the Guildhall a number of years ago, they moved their staff down to this building. As you can see here, this was the original canopy for that station. It's not as, I got a bit of film in a few minutes, which I filmed in 2001, and it shows a bit more of the platform than there is here today. So where we're looking down, that's where the rail line came in. And that was partly the problem with this station, is that it was really a terminus, and any railway station wanted to come in and out of it, they've either had to reverse out or to be turned round before they came in. So that was really the major problem about it. George Hudson also had to look at the interconnectivity with the city as well, because where this comes in today is sort of not too far from the end of Leeds-Selby Bridge, and really just behind it is that very fine five-star hotel as well, that was built for the Midland Railway Company and its successors. And at that time, Leeds-Selby Bridge hadn't been built, and that's what George Hudson was proposing when he opened this station, that he would pay for a bridge across the River Ouse that would go into the city centre. He never did that, and it was up to the council in the end to build that bridge quite a number of years later, in the late 1860s. So anybody coming to York by train would get off here and then would have to go down what is now called George Hudson Street, and then to cross the only bridge at that time, which was the Ouse Bridge across into the city centre. So it wasn't ideally placed for traffic into that, and really a lot of railway stations then had to look at that interconnectivity with the greater part of the city. That's why I say Marsh Lane at Leeds was too far out of the city centre, and we're in a very poor part of Leeds as well, the Bermontoffs Leyland area, which was really one of the poorest and dirtiest parts of Leeds at the time, so not really conducive for passengers really to travel on it, because then they'd have to walk back into the city centre or catch a cab of the day. And similarly, that's what really happened here as well. And there were also very few facilities, because this canopy actually wasn't built until 1845. So if you came in here, there'd been a fairly narrow platform as well. And also these early train stations only had them sort of 10 to 15 feet wide. So there really wasn't much accommodation, and there probably would only been a wooden waiting room as well. And you could say in luxury if one of those waiting rooms had a fire in there, obviously for evenings and during the long winter months as well. The only other thing you'd probably find there would have been the ticket office as well, obviously very important even today. And so they'd been sort of fairly simple affairs, but they were well staffed, largely because wages were very low at the time in the railway industry, and they could afford to have even these very minor stops had a station master. They would have had a clerk, a ticket inspector, they would have had a ticket salesperson, and probably 2 or 3 or more of other people, not really I guess to help staff to help people on and off the train, but to take the goods on and off the train, and obviously when commercial trains came in, probably helping offload goods into the goods sheds, and probably coal into the coal staves and things like that. So very well manned these places were as well. But like I said, the trouble with the old York railway station was its accessibility of shunting trains around to get in and out of here. And that led in 1877 to the building of the new station that we see today. And so this was really, as we see, now built outside the walls, only just though, but it meant that through trains could come through here. It was built for the North Eastern Railway Company at that time, whose architects were Thomas Prosser and William Peachey. Peachey was responsible for quite a few other sort of railway type structures around the place, and opened on the 25th of June 1877. Amazingly, it had 13 railway platforms, which when it opened made it the largest railway station in the world at that time. It's well known for its glass canopy roof, and that's sort of 250 metres long and 75 metres wide. It's all held up together, as you can see, by these cast iron pillars all the way down. I think it's one of the best railway stations in Britain, and I think that Jenkins, in one of his books, put it in the top 10 of the railway stations as well, largely really as a result of its curved roof. I've got a bit of film here, but I must profess that I filmed it in 2001 on some non-digital stock, so it hasn't worn very well, but it gives an impression of really what was happening in the railway industry in York at the time.
Hudson was a larger-than-life figure, full of energy. Our bluff didn't go down well with the sophisticated people in the south of England, but he had what it took to make the railways come to York. And he made a lot of money, both for himself and for other people as well. But he became a cropper in the late 1840s, when there was a downturn in the railway market for shares, and people were losing money hand over fist. George Hudson was, well, he was made a scapegoat and fell from grace. He had been Lord Mayor of the city, but in the 1850s, nobody wanted to know him, to live in exile in France. These days, though, it's recognised that Hudson was a great railway entrepreneur, and that without him, York wouldn't have been the city that it was in the 19th century. After he had disappeared from the railway scene, some of the railway companies that Hudson had helped to set up came together in the North Eastern Railway, which became one of the great railway companies of late Victorian England. It based its headquarters in York, and they're still here, just across the road from the station where we are at the moment. By the end of the 19th century, railways were big business, and the North Eastern Railway was one of the biggest and most profitable of the railway companies in the country. And as befitting its status, the North Eastern built this large headquarters that you can see behind me. Today, York, at the centre of the railway network, is still a city where many railway companies have their headquarters. Here we are at York's railway station, one of the great railway stations of the world. This building was put up in the 1870s when the old station inside the city walls became too small for the number of trains that were going in and out every day. By the middle of the 19th century, York was at the centre of a lot of railway lines from London through to the north of England and Scotland, and from other railways coming from the west of the country, from Manchester and Liverpool, across to the docks in Hull. The station was always a centre of activity, with trains coming and going in all sorts of different colours and liveries. In the 19th century, no fewer than 7 railway companies used to run their trains into York. But then in the 20th century, the railways were nationalised, and it was just British Railways and later British Rail. British Rail electrified the railway through York in the 1980s, but now we're back in the privatised era, with lots of different companies with their different coloured trains working in and out of the station. And now we can go to the National Railway Museum, where we'll see some of the trains that used to run through York in the old days. Here we are in the Great Hall of the National Railway Museum. There's been a railway museum in York since the 1920s. This one wasn't opened until 1975, on the 27th of September 1975 to be precise, which was the 150th anniversary of the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The Great Hall is a huge space, and it's full of lots of wonderful objects, mostly railway locomotives, steam locomotives, diesel locomotives, and 1 or 2 electrics, and lots of carriages that used to carry people around the country for many, many, many years. There are many wonderful things to see here, including Mallard, the world's fastest steam locomotive, which did 126 miles per hour in the 1930s. And just across the way from Mallard, one of the Japanese Shinkansen, or bullet trains, introduced in the 1960s as the pioneer of high-speed passenger railways in the whole of the world. You can see Rocket, or a replica of Rocket, George and Robert Stephenson's locomotive of 1829, which secured the future of steam locomotion on railways around the world. York has long been a centre for railways, and in particular for manufacturing. In the mid-19th century, railway locomotives were built near the museum, and then later in the 19th and throughout the 20th century, railway carriages were built here. Until finally, in the late 20th and early 21st century, York turned to the manufacturing of railway wagons.
There have been railway wagon works in the Holgate part of the city since the 1870s. These wagons you see being built here are the last to be made in the city. At its height at the turn of the 20th century, over 3,000 people used to work here.
So if we look at this sort of expansion of these lines, really, because I mentioned a lot of the acts being passed in 1844, we see the extension of the Aire Valley line in 1845, really, is that a line was built from Leeds to Bradford along the Aire Valley, a very simple, easy line to build. And then really the following year, that was extended to Keighley, and then up to Skipton as well, and beyond that, going northwards as part of the Settle-Carlisle railway line of 1876. This isn't the original station that stands in Keighley. If you know Keighley at all, you come over a bridge, and the bridge has the railway station of today on the left-hand side. But over on the other side of the bridge was the very first station. That sort of stood where Sainsbury's car park is today. But it was rebuilt in 1867 when a line was built down the Worth Valley. This is the one that goes to Haworth and further beyond there. It's quite a short line as well. And the idea behind that was that it linked to the textile mills along that valley, Oakworth and other places where still large mills stand today. Then further on, it really became a triangle of lines around here. The line coming up from the Bradford area, and then we see it going down to Worth Valley, and then eventually, it was extended across to Halifax in 1884, and that's where we see really the railway station as today dates from that sort of 1867, 1884 period, and it's decked out because obviously it's owned by the Worth Valley Railway Line Trust, and therefore still links into the National Rail Network as well. So that's the advantage of the railway system around here. The Worth Valley line was closed in 1962 and opened as a heritage railway in 1968. Necessity, as part of a visit to Haworth, to arrive by steam train and then walk up the steep hill to visit the Brontes up there as well. It's also quite important these railway stations have been immortalised in film, none more so than the Railway Children produced at the beginning of the 1970s. And we see on other railways as well, on the heritage railway lines, is that such as the North York Moors, they've been losing sort of the Harry Potter for the Hogbeed station as well. All very important in the promotion of these, such as, I guess, of bringing the railway to York, because those travellers would come up the country, up the eastern spine, from London to York and then on to Edinburgh, as still they do today. So it attracts thousands of people to come on this railway every year. I don't think really, but people would come to Keighley unless they were to come on the railway station itself. And I guess people get on at the other end as well and travel the full length of it. So a bit of film here, which I've curtailed because it was really a Father Christmas special that goes up to Haworth, but it gives you an impression of what it's like to be on the railway in those days.
Bye-bye, everyone. Ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye.
I mentioned a part of this is that when the line was extended up to Skipton, it was then extended further on as well. And it was really to rival the West Coast main line that really sort of came up from Birmingham to Manchester and then went up to Glasgow. And there was some of the railway companies were seeking an alternate route. Initially, a line had been built up to Giggleswick in 1849. This came from Skipton as well, and then went out to Lancaster, later on extended to Morecambe for the visitors. Largely came from the mill towns of, I guess, Bradford and Keighley, when it was their Wakes weeks and other holidays in the Victorian period as well. And that was known as the Little North Western Railway. And but to rival the West Coast lines, they extended a line that went up to Settle in 1875, and then that went up Ribblesdale to Carlisle, and then went onwards to Glasgow. It was a major feat of engineering and took 6 years to build. 6,000 men were employed building it, 14 tunnels, 20 viaduct, because the 72-mile line opened in 1876. In total, it cost them £3.6 million, which is valued around about £330 million today. I would say probably quite a snip, because I think if we're going to build a railway today, I think we'll be running into billions of pounds of going across there. And it was really built for railways that were going at high speed. They were really going at 60 miles an hour through here, which is very fast in those days. And I say there were a number of railway stations along it. Down at the Settle Station, just off the town centre, is a signal box, which was opened in 1891. That remained in operation until 1984. And it's actually a bit of a visitor attraction down there as well, because there's a traditional signal box with all its levers and things like that. And generally it's open on a Saturday and other times of the year by appointment. To give you an impression of what it was like to be at a railway platform when a steam train came through, and these are operated by a number of companies that run them throughout the year. Rather like at York, they run the Scarborough Express during the summer season, taking visitors, the steam train out to Scarborough and back again. And quite a few of these operate really in the summer months, taking visitors. Really, I mean, I think some of them you can get on at Birmingham really and go up on the Settle-Carlisle railway station. So this is a steam train coming through the station here, and then there's just a bit on Ribblehead itself.
Settle is the start of the rail line that crosses the Dales to Carlisle, 72 miles to the north. Built in 1876 as a rival to the West Coast line to Scotland, it was a major feat of construction, requiring 14 tunnels and 20 viaducts, including the 24-arched Ribblehead viaduct across a bog. Along its route from Settle, it passes the three peaks of Pennygent, Ingleborough and Whernside.
Just a bit lower down before you reach the sort of Ribblehead and Settle itself, as I mentioned right at the beginning, is Helifield Station. Helifield grew as a village along a junction of the A65, and when another road was built out to going out to sort of Clitheroe and Sawley area, that was the A682, and that's what it still stands at there today. But it was also a junction of two railways as well, and So we see that we've got the Skipton Lancaster line coming in here again, which then became the Settle-Carlisle Railway, or the Little Northern Railways. That's where it sort of first was built through here. And then in 1885, a line, because it was on this platform here, that went out to Manchester, Victoria, because via Clitheroe, Sawley, and Gisborne as well. That's the one I mentioned at the beginning that only operates occasionally, and sometimes only in the summer months on a Sunday. Whereas you can see this is a train operating on the Settle-Carlisle Railway as well. It's not right in the centre of Helifield, so if you're driving through Helifield from the Skipton end, as you pass underneath the railway bridge, there's a right turn that takes you up to the railway station itself. It's about a mile along that road, and if you go along it, look at some of the names of the terraces along there that were built for railway workers, and say reflecting the names of the company that owned some of these lines. So we've got Lancashire Terrace, we've got Yorkshire Terrace, and we have Midland Terrace as well. And really why it was sort of stretched down there is that it really wasn't for a passenger station at all, really. It was for the cattle market that they had down here, so that Scottish cattle could be brought down here, offloaded at this station, went straight to the auction mart adjacent to it as well. You can't see it anymore. The auction mart closed in 1990, and now houses have been built on that site. Like I say, there are a number of trains come through here, because the Northern run trains every 2 hours via to Morecambe as well. And from Helifield, you can go to Leeds, and that's about an hour away as well. And the one across to Manchester, Victoria, when it opens, is 46 miles away, but takes 2 hours to get on that, because there's only a couple of trains that they run on there during the season as well. But a lot of people come up here, not to get on the trains, but they all drive up here and they come into this Heritage Cafe. That was opened when the railway station was revamped about 10 years ago. As you can see here, it remains very popular with visitors coming up to there as well. I must say, I enjoyed myself in there as well. So it's a destination in its own right. The railway station is actually embanked up there. The car park is below here. So you've got to go through a tunnel underneath here, which then brings you up to the steps into the middle of the platform. So there's this centralised platform here servicing two railways, which go in completely different ways to one another. Coming further up the line and just jumping across sort of Ribble Head Station, where there's a heritage room in there as well. Again, that's quite a long way from any particular town, although there is the railway hotel that was built down. And that really became part of the sort of the traveller's experience. So when we see that railway station opening in York in 1877, the great railway station was built next to it at the same time. So these railway stations now were designed really for visitors who are coming up here. And so at the Ribble Head one, you've got the pub with rooms next door to that as well. And again, it was probably quite centralised, because not just for walkers and other visitors, but for some of the fairs that were animal fairs that took place behind the pub as well, which no longer takes place. But coming higher up, going up to Dent, which is the highest railway station. I guess the line comes across Ribble Head and then goes through Bleemore Tunnel, the longest tunnel on the line. It took 300 men 4 years to complete. It cost £109,000 or £10 million in today's prices. Like I say, they were fairly low-paid workers, because the navvies on there earning what would be today the equivalent of £22 a day. In order to build that tunnel, they dig huge shafts down from the surface, some of those being 500 feet deep as well. say there were problems with water in there as well, and a number of men drowning in them, but especially during a rainstorm in July 1870. I guess it's like being in a underground cave, and that you don't really know what's going on the surface. The first running of a train came through here was in 1873, before the whole line was completed in 1876. So the line comes out of Bleemore Tunnel, which is actually, looking at this photograph, is a bit further round over here. I think the first viaduct you can see here is the Dent Head Viaduct, and then it comes over another viaduct as it comes around here, the Arton Gill Viaduct, and then comes in at a level here to Dent Station. I don't know why they call it Dent Station, but because Dent's 4.5 miles away. I know what someone came to our talks in Harrogate and Horsforth as a young lad. He came up here to walk and didn't realise that the railway station and Dent town were so far apart. It's the highest station in England at 1,150 feet above sea level. The station building now doesn't operate as such. It's now a bed and breakfast, and you can come up here up what's called the Coal Road. It's an enormously steep road that runs over to the next viaduct at Garsdale up the line as well. So if you're coming around here, you definitely probably not come by train, but come by car, unless you're going to walk in the immediate area around here. Like I say, there are 6 up and down trains daily, and there are quite a number of industrial trains using it as well. British Gypsum runs a cement train through here as well, and some of the stone from the Helwiff Bridge quarries, which are down Ribblesdale, they carry stone up here on the trains too as well. So there's is well used, because this has always been a very contentious railway, and people have always wanted to close it due to the cost of it. Firstly in the Beeching Acts of the 1960s, but gained a reprieve, and I think again in the 1990s they wanted to axe it due to the cost of maintaining it, really. But it really is seen as one of the great scenic railways of England, and has been kept open really for that reason. I think even today they are, as I'm talking, is that they're repairing the Ribblehead Viaduct as well. It's largely because of its exposed position, and a lot of water freezes into ice and into the joints and pulls the masonry apart. So let's finish on that one and go somewhere right in the West Riding to Huddersfield, which probably has the finest railway station of the lot. The whole of the town centre was owned by the Ramsden family right into the 1920s, when they sold it to Huddersfield Corporation for £1.3 million. And so the mill owners here were building grand houses, and I guess that the Ramsdens had to be convinced to have a railway station here, and that it had to reflect really the nature of Huddersfield and its preeminence really in what they call fancy goods. These are the fancy fabrics which we use largely for waistcoats, as they probably say in those days, and other things, whereas Bradford did worsteds and Halifax did much cheaper materials around there. So they're all, because they're manufacturing different types of things, but they obviously wanted things to reflect how important they were as well. And so this is built by the Huddersfield and Manchester Railway and Canal Company, later becoming part of the LNWR in July 1847, and then later the Manchester and Leeds Railway Company. I say that these mergers and acquisitions, because they went on decade after decade, and so this line was to come to meet other lines as well. So that a line coming up from Sheffield to here as well. The foundation stone was laid on the 8th of October 1846 by Josh Fitzwilliam, the Lord Lieutenant, and it was a public holiday, and church bells were rung from dawn to dusk, it was said, and it opened for services in October 1847, although the station wasn't completed until a year later than that. Because it really was only a one-track line to begin with until 1886, and then they started to expand the railway station beyond that as well to cover other various lines coming in. I think if you go and look at the back of it, there's sort of 6 or 7 lines that seem to come into there, and then they put the canopy over that as well. Because when they built the canopy, unfortunately, 4 men were killed in its construction when it collapsed. So really what we see here, it was, as an architectural historian said, Ian Nairn said, it's a stately home with trains in it. It cost over £20,000 to build the frontage. The architect was James Pickett of York, and the builder was a local man called Joseph Kay. And he was quite an important railway builder as well, was Pickett Pritchard as well. He put the new facade on the assembly rooms in York and some of the other buildings in St Helens Square in York as well. The facade here is 416 foot long. The central pediment here is backed by what will really be railway company's offices as well. These columns stand 68 foot high as well, with single-storey wings on either side. One of these continues as a pub today. They were actually really built on one side as refreshment rooms for those visitors that would come in, and probably visitors who came to see it as well. And like I say, the important part of that is that it opened up this area called St George's Square in front of it. So really what they were creating was a new centre for Huddersfield, and really all the other buildings in Huddersfield largely predate this. Some huge, fantastic Victorian buildings around this square, including the St George Hotel, where rugby league, the rules of that was founded in there. It's been taken over in the last year by the Huddersfield or Kirklees Council, who were worried that it had been empty for a number of years, and they were going to refurbish it and keep the museum in there, and I guess try and find someone to operate it as a hotel as well. The statue here, that's to Sir Harold Wilson, Prime Minister 1964 to 70 and 74 to 76. He was born in Huddersfield, and that's why it's here. And Wilson lived between 1916 and died in 1995. It's by Ian Walters, the sculptor, and opened in 1999 by Tony Blair. Prior to that, a statue of Sir Robert Peel stood here. So I don't know where he's been relegated to. So that's the fine station at Huddersfield. Halifax had to have a fine station as well. The railway from Manchester reached here in 1844, and 6 years later it was extended to Bradford in 1850. And because they came this as the main, one of the main routes, alternative routes to Manchester from Yorkshire. And the railway station that we see here was opened in 1855. I guess it will be a rival to Huddersfield Station because that was 1850 or thereabouts when it was completed. This was completed 1855, and Huddersfield is only 8 miles away from it. And they say is that Halifax was just a great centre for the textile industry as well. Probably renowned more today for the great carpet mill of Dean Clough, built by the Crossley family, as a range of other companies in the town as well. It's no longer a railway station. In the year 2000, the Children's Museum, Eureka, took over this building as well, so extending into that. And that's really what we see here in there. That's the railway bridge in there. A line would have come up here. That's taken. We can see the railway station that's used today. We've got a glass canopy over the top of those lines. That just stands just behind there. You can see a bit of the rear of the building, but it is the rear of the building and was not meant to be really seen because it's purely functional. This line also has some other fine railway stations on it, so it's worth a trip up there. You can it can go 2 ways now, go to Manchester, or it goes out to Blackburn and beyond as well, because the rail line splits at Toppington, as we'll see. The next station really up from here, well, 2 up from here, is Hebdon Bridge Station, And we see is that parliamentary approval was given for the building of this line way back in 1836. But I think it was the engineering problems with that. The initial line, like I say, it sort of was extended to Bradford in 1850, but originally it went through Halifax and then ended up at Normanton near Castleford. And it went there because there it would join the Leeds-Selby line. So that's even important where because of that, why it got permission in 1836 for the building of this. And the engineer of the line was George Stephenson as well. And that part of the line opened in 1840, or parts of it opened in 1840 because they had great other problems with it as well, the building of tunnels up here as well. So really what you see at Hebdon Bridge is really the platform and the railway engine buildings here dated from 1893. Like I say, in the waiting room, they just have a small display of how the railway has affected the town and how it has looked since it was first opened. So going higher up, we come up to Todmorden, really coming higher up, we come up to Todmorden, really the last place in the West Yorkshire, in the West Riding. At one time, the Lancashire-Yorkshire border used to run through the centre of the town hall. It doesn't anymore, and Todmorden is wholly within Yorkshire. Its first link came with the between Yorkshire and Lancashire with the building of the Rochdale Canal, but people were completely against it and don't really understand why, because it was actually a boon for the mill owners, the large mill owners here with the Fieldon family, who had cotton mills in the town, and therefore they actually wanted the cotton to come up here as quickly and cheaply as possible. But when there was a mooting of the building of a line here, is that 2,000 investors immediately sank their money into the building of it, including the Fieldon family, who had objected to the Rochdale Canal coming through that fully opened, I think, in 1811. And because it was a very complex line to be built, especially in this area, because it had to pass, they had to build the Summit Tunnel, which basically goes through the underneath the centre of the Pennines, going from Todmorden through to Littleborough on the Lancashire side, because it's 1.6 miles long. When that was completed, it was the longest tunnel in the world. It was all dug by hand as well. And similar to the Blee Moor Tunnel, they had to dig down from the surface in order to create the air shafts and actually to get equipment and stone in and out. Took 23 million bricks this time to create the interior lining of it, and that was the why it was delayed in the opening of that. And I think in the 1970s, actually caught fire in there as well. But at Todmorden, like I say, the line splits. What we're looking at here is the line that runs to Manchester, but just before it approaches a viaduct across the town is that a junction is there, and it goes up the Cliviger Valley and goes to Burnley and out to Blackburn and beyond. Oddly enough, both railways are still operational through here as well. But even though they got the agreement in 1836, or the act to build the line, it actually goes back even further than that, is that a company was formed, the Leeds to Manchester company. They were formed in 1825. It was they then who appointed the surveyor of Robert Stevenson in 1830. Like I say, is that construction didn't start until 1837. It stopped for a couple of years because of the economic crisis as well. And then in 1839, the line was opened from Manchester to Littleborough, the other side, the next station on from Todmorden through here, largely due to the complex engineering works. To the back of where I am is that the viaduct crosses right across the centre of the town. That was built in 1840, and there's a high level one as well. So it's got quite a good approach into the station from the Halifax end. The station here, these rooms have now all been converted into art studios. That's what you can see along there as well, which is again a novel use for it, but it's actually maintaining these buildings that otherwise probably would no longer be used, and a lot of them have been demolished on lines because of the cost of maintaining them. As we'll see down here at Penistone. This was part of the Sheffield line that went to Huddersfield, and also a line came off here as well that went to Manchester, and because these were largely built in the mid 1840s. One of the lines requiring a huge 29 arch viaduct, 900 feet long and 80 foot above the edge, above the valley. That's right on the edge of the town. So if you're coming in from the Barnsley direction, that's the first thing you see as approaching Penistone itself. And it sort of came in on a level, these lines did, but not through the town centre. So you've got to walk out of the town, down the hill, to get to the station itself. And there are sort of two stations. There's a good station on the approach to the town that most people drive up the hill to Penistone to get to, but that was a good station and not the passenger railway station. The passenger railway station, if you know Penistone, it's got a very fine sort of 1920s Art Deco cinema in there, which has a cinema organ in it. And I think it's brought up from Birmingham or somewhere. But the railway station is, again, half a mile or more from the centre of the town down there. And because this was sort of the line to Manchester was closed in the 1960s, just leaving what they call sometimes the Penistone line from Huddersfield to Sheffield. It's also this line, funnily enough, is just here, right at the end of there. So the platform of the, which is currently used, is sort of, this forms a sort of V shape, this does. So this is the old station that closed in the 1960s. We're seeing, although we're seeing the sort of the front of it onto the tracks, you can see where the track bed was, it's used as a car park the other side for a range of small businesses in here. I think one of these sells fireplaces or something like that. That's why we've got the security grills on this side as well. So poor old the old Penistone station is no more around there. So we mentioned that these approaches by viaducts, which are fantastic approaches into towns. Mentioned Todmorden here at Penistone as well, but perhaps the finest is at Knaresborough, where the York to Harrogate line, this opened in 1851, eventually because they had to build a viaduct across the River Nid that was completed in 1851. This is the second viaduct, you see, because as Mother Shipton prophesied, is that the first one would fall down. Well, it did just prior to the completion of the railway on Saturday, the 11th of March, 1848. The destruction of that, I think it was inherent weakness, probably the rock bed it was built into, and maybe the foundations weren't strong enough, but it sort of collapsed. It raised the water level in the River Nid down there by 12 feet, and because they killed all the fish in the river and caused a lot of pollutions. Pity the poor builder who'd probably been accused of not building it properly because it had to be rebuilt at a cost of £10,000, and the line eventually opened on the 1st of October 1851. Until then, it terminated at this side of the town, so the York trains could go no further than this, coming through the tunnel there, and then the station, even when the viaduct was opened, it never actually went to Harrogate to begin with. It terminated at Starbeck because of the issues of bringing the railway into Harrogate. We've seen the first station built in Harrogate was at the Leeds Road end of the Stray, because the Harrogate Improvement Commissioners didn't want a noisy, smelly railway to be brought into the town, because this would affect the visitors. And that's why when it was opened up, it was put in a cutting across the Stray. And then that's when that really happened, that the line fully opened across here. So let's go up and look at the another scenic railway, and that's the North York Moors Railway, built 1846, runs to Whitby to join the national network as well. The line used to extend to Malton, but that was closed in 1965. So one time you go from Whitby to Malton and then go on to York as well. But unfortunately, that bit has been severed from Pickering to Malton, and it really sort of goes across fields across there. And like I said, the line was brought back into use in 1973 by the North York Moors Railway, and it's the longest steam railway in the UK at, I've put here 18 miles, but someone corrected me that and thinking, I think it's 20 or 21 miles long. So let's have a journey on the North York Moors Railway.
This is Pickering Station, the southern terminus of the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. 18 glorious scenic miles through the valley bottoms of the North Yorkshire Moors up to the port of Whitby. Now, the line was designed and built in 1836 by the famous Victorian railway engineer George Stephenson, he of the Rocket, of course, and the Stockton and Darlington Railway, some miles to the north of here. Now, interestingly, when the line was first built, well, there wasn't a steam engine to be seen. The coaches and the wagons were all pulled by horses. The first steam engines didn't appear until 1847. And then, of course, the line was used to carry coal, stone and passengers. Well, you can hear the noise. I think it's time to get on board and enjoy the glorious scenery of the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. Until 1948, the railways in this country were operated by private companies, but then came nationalisation and the need to rationalise the network. So this particular line was axed by the infamous Dr Beeching in 1965. But so incensed were local people that they got together to see if they couldn't keep the line open and run the occasional steam train. Well, the services were so popular that by 1973 the whole thing had to be formalised into the North Yorkshire Moors Railway. These days there are 150 employees supported by 300 volunteers, and they do everything from stoking up the boilers before the first train at 5 o'clock in the morning to damping them down again after the last train gets back at 7 o'clock at night. Well, these days this line links into the National Rail Network at Whitby. There are services every day during the spring and summer months and at weekends during the winter. And most years, well, about 300,000 people or more travel this line. Well, this is our stop, Goathland, and you may of course recognise this place as the fictional village Aidensfield in the ITV series Heartbeat, or also as Hogsmeade Station in the Harry Potter films. About a mile from here, the valley drops 300 foot into Beck Hole, and that posed a few problems for the early engineers, but they came up with an ingenious solution. A rope and pulley system would actually haul the trains up the incline, and that worked fine until 1864 when there was an accident, the rope snapped and 2 people were killed. So then they tried to work out and find a flatter route, so they blasted through the rocks. And shortly after that, steam engines came along which were powerful enough to cope with the incline. There was a reason to build a railway to Whitby in the mid-1830s, to export the fish being landed here, to meet the growing demands of the industrial cities of York, Leeds, Bradford and even further afield. So a line was built from Malton on the York Main Line, across the North York Moors via Pickering to Whitby in 1835. Although until 1845 and the advent of more powerful steam engines, it was horse-drawn due to the severe gradient out of Gromont. That railway was joined by another in 1883. It ran up the coast from Whitby to Loftus. this time to export alum and ironstone being mined in the cliffs. The line along the coast was completed in 1885, when a line was also built to Scarborough from Whitby. Built by different private railway companies, they wanted the quickest, most direct route to industrial centres. So in 1861, a branch was built from Gromont to Middlesbrough, the Esk Valley Line. Rationalisation of the rail network in the mid-1960s saw the closure of both lines running along the coast through Whitby and the line from Whitby to Malton, leaving just the Esk Valley Line operating. But the Malton line, the section from Pickering to Whitby, was rescued in 1973 by the North York Moors Railway, who operate diesel and steam trains along it. At 18 miles in length, it makes it the longest heritage railway in Britain, and it's a wonderful way to arrive at the port.
So this was one of the lines that connected through to the coast, largely because about the Gromont one was important for the export of iron ore going up the Esk Valley Line, which is still open. And there are other lines further down that went out to Wivensey and another out to Hornsey. And there's also the line that really came out of Hull through via Beverley, but came out to the coast as well, the Bridlington line, but then connected at the Seymour Junction on the line from York to Scarborough. That then continues northwards from Scarborough, as we've seen there at Whitby, going across the Larpool Viaduct, as it's called. You can walk across there now, and indeed you can walk on that track from Scarborough right up to Whitby, called the Cinder Track. You can cycle on it now. I think you can take your horse as well if you've got one with you. That then continued northwards again up to Robin Hood's Bay and right up the coast to Redcar, and then sort of went through to Middlesbrough as well. Most of that has been lost, but the Bridlington line is still there because this opened in 1846 and because they were connected up to the York Scarborough Railway line at Seymour 1847. And it was just as important for the fish trade as it was for the visitors as well. And it sort of really had a near enough immediate impact on Filey because it was sort of quite a way away from the, it was, I guess, fairly easy to get to Scarborough from York, but not to Filey. And therefore we see the building of the Crescent in Filey and it laid out as a sort of upmarket Victorian visitor place to go to, which it still is today as well, and really quite a genteel port. And that's the railway station that we're looking here at Filey, just really again a protected shed near enough as it passes through the town. So that line's still open. We've also got another odd line in Yorkshire called the Ghost Line. There's a number of these across Britain, and they were largely as a result of them largely being used for moving industrial goods around, but not really for passengers. But sometimes under the terms and conditions and acts and things like that, is that they've got to have passenger trains running along them. And therefore, they're sometimes called ghost lines because you can't really travel on them apart from maybe just once a day. So this is the line that was built from Wakefield via Pontefract out to Goole, opened in 1848. And I say this one again really principally for the carrying of coal down there as well. So this is Hensall Station along this line, and one of the least used passenger railway routes in the country. Michael Portillo in his railway series in 2015 travelled on it from Nottingham to Goole, where there's just one train a day each way. It stops here at 6:42 in the evening, gets to Goole and comes back out, and you could say you can go to Goole for probably a couple of minutes, because it reappears here, stopping again at 4 minutes past 8 in the evening. But really is that because the next station along from here is Snaith. But largely this railway is used for moving originally coal up to Drax, and now it's biomass up to Drax. And as I said before, it's really to maintain its legal status as a passenger railway, because who knows in the future when it might become an important railway again. So that's why there's only one railway put along here. And sort of moving towards the end now, just look at the Beeching cuts. And these really came around for a number of reasons. The railways were nationalised in 1948. And because they, in the 1950s, a number of miles of railway were cut, largely because the railways were overstaffed, because they had so many people at even these smaller railway stations like Hensel would have had as well. People no longer travelled on them as much because they'd all bought cars in the sort of 1950s and early 1960s. Some lines that were built were never profitable, and that some have been built for industrial use and were now no longer required. So a lot of those railways moving sort of coal from Barnsley to Hull, they were no longer required at that time, because North Sea gas had come in, and so there was a decline in the amount of coal that was required as well. So since 1948, across Britain, 3,000 miles had been cut already, and the payroll had been reduced by 26%. Say in the early 1950s, 648,000 people worked for the Nationalised Railway Company, but come 1960, that had been reduced to 474,000 people. I ought to look to see how many they sort of employed today, although it might be quite difficult to find those. Richard Beeching, pictured here, was the chairman of British Railways, as it was known then, and he produced a report entitled Reshaping of British Railways. In 1963, Britain's railways were running at a loss of £140 million a year. To put that into perspective, that's £300,000 a day. And Dr Beeching had made it his job to, as he said, make the railways pay. And he looked at reducing the number of railway stations. Then there were 7,000 railway stations, and he decided to cut 2,363 of these stations and 250 railway services as well. Basically, what he did, as you can see on this map he's pointing at, he kept the major trunk lines, but pruned the branch lines. As we see in Yorkshire, many of them leading to the holiday destinations, so of Withensea and Hornsey as well. I can say few won a reprieve. In Yorkshire, as I mentioned earlier, the Settle-Carlisle line did, as well as the York-Harrogate line. That's the one that goes across the Nid Viaduct at Knaresborough. Ilkley railway station was earmarked for closure, but that was reprieved as well. Today, it's quite a popular commuter line, especially at intermediary lines like stations like Menson and Guisey on that route. And the Ilkley railway station is now taken up by retail. So they can make it pay. It lost its section from Ilkley across to what is the Bolton Abbey station, but that was opened as a heritage line from Bolton Abbey to Emsey, and still connects through to Skipton as well. Ripon didn't fare as well, as the original line built then was from Leeds to Thirsk, that opened in 1846, and that was axed as well, and so eventually Ripon was marooned from the railway network, whereas like I said, it probably would have remained quite a popular one today, because people could link through to Fountains Abbey or just into the city itself. But But in 2020, the government announced a £500 million fund to look at 50 railway lines that have been axed by Beeching in Yorkshire. By Beeching. In Yorkshire, these include extending the Wensleydale Railway to Hawes, reopening the Skipton to Colne line, which has been mooted and talked about and costed, I guess, for the last 25 years, to look again at the York-Beverley line that crosses the Wolds via Pickering Station, and reopen stations at Keighley and Millhouses on the existing line that goes south of Sheffield through to Totley and then into Derbyshire, and opening a new station at Rotherham, where I think the advanced manufacturing facility is, to try and open up that as a jobs market around there as well, and also providing a daily service on the Worth Valley Railway line. So this is the impact that he's sort of had. I've mentioned a couple of these stations already. This is the Hornsey Station, because it had a major effect on the town. In 1851, it had a population of just 1,005 people. After the opening of the railway in 1864, the 1871 census records 1,685 people living in the town there. In fact, there were two stations. The first station they came across had been called Hornsey Bridge, and then this one was called Hauncy Town. This lies right behind the sea front. It was actually paid for privately by a timber merchant called John Wade, who had come to live in Hornsey in 1846. And that's why the original station only came as far as Hornsey Bridge. So that's what he paid for. But the plans were changed, and I guess the town council at that time decided it would be good to bring visitors in up to here as well. The problem was, from Hornsey Bridge to the seafront, which is only probably a mile, is that it came across sand dunes and very boggy land, and the construction of that first line was £68,000. The extension onto here cost £44,000 to bring it there, to say it was only the shortest part of the line as well. In 1873, Hornsey had become the quaintest mixture of a small country town and a callow sea bathing place. The better half of it is little more than a marine suburb of Hull. So that's the effect that the railway had on that, because the line axed, but fortunately the railway buildings were saved from demolition and restored as houses in 1991. Because a number of lines cross the Wolds. I think there's 3 of them, some going across really from Beverley to Market Wheaton, which is a line that the Pickering Station's on. It's absolutely miles away from anywhere, probably best known for the horse race that's run around here on the in March in midweek as well. But that horse race takes nowhere near Pickering Station. Like I say, it's a good 1.5 miles, 2 miles away across country as well. And so that up here, it's been bought as a house. The yard around that, it's got a woodworks and joinery makers workshop in there. And in fact, the line here is now called the Hudson Way, and joins in with the Wilberforce Way as well. So you can actually cycle along it. So in fact, it's the car parking here. It's normally quite busy in here for people who are normally taking bikes, and the cabinet workers workshop is opened up and has a bit of I wouldn't say a cafe in it, but you can buy drinks and ice cream in there as well. So this is part of the one we're looking at reopening of it again, because in 2013, a report was drawn up into reopening of the line and concluded that at that time, it would cost £239 million and it wouldn't make a profit. But they're still obviously looking at that. Another one which has been lost completely is I'd say called Alliston Station, although you say to me I'm saying it's wrong because it says Ebbston on the sign over here, but in fact it is at Alliston, and Ebbston's a mile away from it. But it's one of those quirks of the railway industry. And in 1879, the North Eastern Railway, because they were constructing the Pickering to Scarborough branch, opened on the 1st of May 1882. It's a 16-mile route that basically runs alongside alongside the A170 between, say, Pickering and Scarborough, and because it was then called the Forge Valley line as well. So it's completely flat running along here. It, in fact, it predated the Beeching cuts because it closed to passengers on the 3rd of June 1950 and was finally axed in 1960. But all the railway stations exist along there. And like I say, the railway station initially was called Wilton here for reasons unknown, because there's no village of Wilton nearby. And so they decided to change it because of the Wiltons across England. But rather than change it to Allaston, maybe because they probably thought it might be misheard as Allerton or something like that, it was renamed Ebbston in 1903, because despite the village of Ebbston being a mile away. The station was brought by a train enthusiast in 1997, and he started collecting mementos of the Forge Valley line, and then a few years later, collection of 200 railway carriages came up for sale. They've been collected by Peter Waterman, Edward Fox. Peter Waterman did the Kylie Minogue songs. He was known as a Hit Factory, and Edward Fox, the actor. They wanted to run a heritage line, but gave up with all the red tape involved and auctioned the carriages off. The owner of this bought some of these carriages and brought them up here, and now they are bed and breakfast accommodation. So you can actually stay at Ebbston Station in one of these, and say some of it is self-accommodation as well. He showed me around it as well when I was up there taking these photographs, and showed me the visitor book that people come from Belgium, Holland, and the southeast of Britain. So this is one way of reutilising a station, I guess, as an attraction for his bed and breakfast. The station at Richmond, right at the top of North Yorkshire, because this line opened in 1946. It's a 9-mile stretch of line that linked into the very first railway line, the Stockton to Darlington line that opened in 1825. This was really to carry agricultural goods and other goods out of Swaledale, and obviously to bring up other goods as well, like coal and things like that, because it cut the sort of transport costs as well around here. This bit of the line was constructed by George Hudson of York as well. The line closed in 1969 as part of the Beeching cuts, and in 2007 the railway station reopened as a community trust project. Saw, as you can see here on this picture, the 2 cinemas have opened in there. I think there's a bakery, I think there's a microbrewery in there, and obviously you can see here the cafe. The cafe down here is actually on the rail bed, so you can see the steps coming down here. This is the platform, those are the steps down onto the rail bed. Because it's also got an exhibition space on a mezzanine level. That's where you go up these steps to around there. You can see from this photograph, I think this 2018, how busy it is as well. So these are, because they are very popular attractions, and now we're seeing sometimes reopenings of stations as well. Wakefield had 2 railway stations, Westgate, which is on the East Coast main line and just below the city centre, and Kirkgate station. This opened in 1840 and was on the Manchester to Leeds railways. So that's the one that was coming through to Normanton, and that first Halifax line being built as well. So trains now go here southwards as well, Barnsley to Sheffield. They can also go eastwards, continue on to Pontefract. The station was actually built on the site of Asplin's Portland Cement Works. He invented it and was made first here in Wakefield. These buildings date back to 1854 and have warehouses on either side. I ought to have shown you the photograph of what it looked like in probably 2016. It was really run down, boarded up, and because I don't think was really used at all. But really, since the opening of that is that, or reutilization of it, we've had the opening of the Hepworth Gallery, which is really about a 5-minute walk away, and also the rebuilding of the West Yorkshire Archive, which used to stand right at the other end of the town. So I think it's seen probably as a catalyst to bring visitors in to look at both of these things and to regenerate that part of town as well. It was quite interesting when I took this photograph, which I think was 2019, is that many of the services that have been axed by Northern Rail, I've been there hoping that a train might come through. I was told by some of the Northern Rail engineers who were on the platform that the train had just passed through and it had been 35 minutes later. The next train that was due had been cancelled. The staff were unsurprised and said it was potluck if anything came by. So there's no guarantee that you'd actually get to where you wanted. Like I say, it fully reopened in 2018. Other stations have been opened as well, especially on the Leeds-Bradford Air Valley line, that one that was first built in 1846, running from Leeds to Bradford and extended to Keighley. They've opened 2 stations along that, largely because until these opened in 2018, you can actually travel from 14 miles from Leeds to Shipley and actually not stop, even though it was going to pass through Kirksall, Haworth, and other places before they got to it. So they opened 2 new stations, one at Kirksall and the other at Ilkley Bridge, really replacing some of those stations that have been closed and demolished years before. So I'm going to bring after all this time, the talk to a close.